Good afternoon. My name is Crystal Davis with ConnXus. On behalf of the My Connection Business Center, we would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to attend this very important webinar on supplier relationship management. My Connection Business Center provides a single location where integrated business development services are available to suppliers on demand. The webinar will be presented today by Ms. Toi Clarke Jones with Onyx Sourcing Solutions, one of our affiliate partners. This presentation will be recorded and available by request. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. Also, please take time to answer the four very short questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, stay tuned for information on upcoming myCBC webinars. Now, I will turn it over to Ms. Toi Clarke Jones, and she will begin the webinar.
Good afternoon or good evening. I'm not sure what time zones we're dealing with, but welcome to today's webinar. I'm happy that you all have joined. I hear there's a lot of people that registered. I can't see how many people have joined, but I'm happy to have you here. I am going to speak with you over the next 40 minutes or so about this topic around supplier relationships. And really, there are three parts to this, and I'll explain them in a minute after I introduce myself more. But I just want you to know that the meat of the supplier relationships topic is going to be kind of the first and second portions. So let me start by telling you a little bit about who I am. So this is kind of a caricature of me in my my imagined thinner self. But my name is Toi Clarke Jones. I have had about 30-year career in business, most of which was in corporate America. I spent 23 years with the Procter & Gamble company, starting as a finance leader, and then I moved after about 4 years into purchasing or strategic sourcing. So most of my career was as a buyer or a manager of buyers throughout the world. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and my business, Onyx Sourcing Solutions, got started about 7 years ago, where I branched out to really work with other companies to build their strategic sourcing capability. I believe that a lot of companies can benefit from really taking the approach of analyzing their markets and their approach to their supply chain in a different way and driving better results from that. So that's kind of what I do as a part of Onyx Sourcing Solutions. I work on helping companies design and develop their organization. I do a lot of training. I help them with thinking about how to get new opportunities from their spend, and I help them with their strategies for dealing with suppliers and dealing with, in some cases, customers. So I'm an evangelist for strategic sourcing. And so what is strategic sourcing? It's really, this visual kind of can help you if you're not very familiar, but it's really like creating a bridge between what a company needs and how they can fulfill that need. So what capability is out there to fulfill that need, both what is available today and, more importantly, what can we create to be available in the future. And so to do this well, it requires having a strategy, and the strategy is basically a roadmap that describes how you want to spend your money in this market and get more value over time. It requires a focused way to influence your internal stakeholders so that they can make changes sometimes that will allow them to get better value from the external market. And it requires having some way to measure whether or not you are getting the value that you intend to get. So on this webinar, I know that some of you are buyers and many of you are sellers. And we're going to talk about this topic. We're really going to talk about three topics, primarily from the vantage point of how sophisticated buyers operate. And when I say sophisticated buyers, what I mean are buyers that are not just concerned with getting goods and services at a good price, but are focused on total value, which can include many more things than price. And as I'll probably say really quickly here, value is in the eye of the beholder, and that's where this understanding of business needs really is so essential to being able to do this well. So as Crystal mentioned, we'll take questions at the end, and I'm happy to do that. So the first topic that we're going to talk is really about due diligence. So professional buyers understand the supplier capability that's available and what they're really trying to get for their business. And I challenge my buyers. I did this as a manager. I do this with my clients now. I challenge buyers to stop calling suppliers a good supplier or a bad supplier. That's really too simple. We need to really think more critically about first, what do we need? What do we get from the supplier? So whether it's one supplier or several suppliers for a particular buy, sophisticated buyers should ask themselves, what combination of things makes this the best value option? So, thinking about things, as an example, things like location, how does location affect whether or not we're getting best value? A supplier can be very reliable and have, a lot of positives, but maybe their location creates more cost in the supply chain, whether it's cost of transportation, cost to hold inventory, et cetera. And that combination of things may make it not as attractive. Sometimes it's about things like the supplier's attitude. You could have a supplier that is great at making something, once again, but maybe they are a supplier that overcommits consistently and underdelivers in terms of timelines, et cetera. So that goes into thinking about what do you really need or why do you need them. So there are a lot of things that go into, understanding a supplier and how we think about them or should think about them beyond the simplistic good or bad. I think another good question is, how are the business expectations changing? So value is, once I mentioned earlier, value is in the eye of the beholder. And the beholder, the people who have to either use the item that's being purchased or are the recipient of the service that is being provided, they determine what value is. And their needs, their identification of value really is changing all the time. It's migrating. And we need to do a better job of outlining how that migration looks so that we can explain that better to the suppliers that we're looking at or that we're working with. As a real simple example, at one point, a supplier managing inventory for you could be a really big deal, but over time, if more and more that becomes common in the market, that's no longer as valuable because you can get it from a number of sources. So expectations change, and we need to be more mindful about how we talk about the way that value changes as those expectations change. And then the third question here is, really being clear about how the supplier's capability matches not just what we need today, but what we need in the future. And, a lot of suppliers can get what I call a halo effect. So, this supplier is our favorite because they did this in 2010. And not diminishing, what was delivered in 2010, but that was a long time ago. And so it's more about what have you done for me lately and what are you doing that helps me based on what I need into the future. So we really need to be more thoughtful as buyers about our questions. And if you're on the supplier side, you also need to be more thoughtful about how do you describe yourself and your capability to be able to get at the things that the buyers really should be probing. Sophisticated buyers really look at both upside opportunity and downside risk as they're looking at suppliers, whether they're current suppliers or new potential suppliers. And so this is just a simple way of describing this. You know, there are 3 different types of areas to probe to really do due diligence on your supply base. And in each of these, you know, there's a ton of questions that can be asked and should be asked to satisfy yourself that you've got a good fit. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to walk through the words on this slide, but I'm going to give you an example from my own life of how these things kind of work together. So many years ago, this is a Procter & Gamble story, and it's been so long, I don't think I have any problem telling it, but many years ago, I was buying manufacturing services, and we had a need. We were going to put a new product into the market, and we didn't have the equipment and know-how to do this ourselves. So we were going to work with a third party to make the product. It was a folded paper product, and it doesn't even exist anymore. So another reason why I can tell this story. Well, anyway, we went out and found a third-party manufacturer to make this product. They didn't make this exact product because this exact product didn't exist at the time, but they made a similar product. They made a similar product that was a folded paper product, but they made it for another market. They made it to really satisfy the medical industry. So we found a supplier. We satisfied ourselves that they could make the product. They were located on the West Coast. They were located in the state of Washington, and kind of that was the foundation. We decided to get into business with them, and so now walking through how it relates to these 3 areas. The first thing from a strategic fit standpoint. So strategic fit is about really understanding where does this business, this supplier, how do they want to go to market? How do they want to grow? How do they plan to make money, basically? And what you're looking for is an overlap between, the best scenario is where there's an overlap between how the supplier wants to grow and what you need. You know, the thing that you need fits with their growth area. And the reason why that's the best scenario is because both parties are getting something that they want out of it, and it's clear to see how they can get what they want out of it. So in my example, this was a second-generation family business. The owner was the son of the founder. As I said, they made folded paper products for the medical industry. We understood that. What we didn't quite think about was the fact that they had, the medical industry operates very, very different than the consumer goods industry. It's a different pace. For the most part, the supplier was producing to go into a long supply chain. I mean, there's lots of buffer inventory in that supply chain. Whereas for the consumer goods industry, that's not exactly the case. It's much more a faster pace. Things have to operate in a tighter timeline. The reliability measurement is much more important. So that was different, but we didn't quite think enough about that. From an operational side, now operations is usually your kind of cost quality service, and of course everybody looks at that. But we didn't really spend enough time looking at the depth of their talent, because in order to operate well, you've got to have the people, the staff with the experience to do that. And oh, by the way, I told you the supplier was located in the state of Washington. That wasn't where we needed them to be. We needed them to be in more like the southeast. So we asked them to start up a new facility in Georgia, which they were very willing to do, but it overextended them too much. They didn't have the depth of talent to do a startup on the other side of the country. They didn't have the startup experience. They didn't have the project management capability. They were really slow with problem analysis, and it caused huge, huge frustrations. So that's an example of operational fit. On the chemistry side, so, I talked earlier about it's important that you understand the attitude of the supplier. Well, on the chemistry side, we really didn't speak each other's language. They were a small business. They, knew the medical industry very well, and they spoke that language, but we were new to them. We were a bigger company speaking a different language, and very quickly, this miss between how we were communicating caused a loss of confidence in the supplier. So to sum all this up, almost everything went wrong. It was quite a bad experience for everyone, so much so that we ended up not being able to resolve enough of these things, and we had to take over the facility and buy them out. So it was it's one of those experiences etched in my brain around what not to do, but it made me a much better buyer over time because of them. But this is what I'm talking about, is when you're going in and you're doing due diligence, people tend to focus on, all the things they're looking for. You see what you're looking for, and that's usually the good stuff. But we have to look at what the downside is as well so that we can prepare for it. And that leads me to my next point, which is, supplier analysis is really a skill. And it's a skill that it involves a lot of different focus areas. So really quickly, we've got a model here called the scope model that just gives you a flavor for what kind of things are involved in that analysis to do it well. The strategic fit, so this is about the ownership and business strategy, the growth goals, where they want to go and how they want to grow. And you're looking for an alignment of interest, as I mentioned before. That's what you're looking for with strategic fit. Where are our interests in alignment? The C is for customer portfolio. This is really about who are their top customers, understanding not just who are their top customers in terms of, do you care, their competitor, but more, what kinds of businesses, what kinds of operations are they used to? As I said, in the case of my example, their top customers were in an area where they had a certain rhythm, and we were going to have a very different rhythm. And understanding that, if we had understood that better, we could have maybe mitigated some of the risks that we ended up encountering. So that's what we're looking for a lot in customer portfolio. It also will tell you a lot about how they do customer service, and understanding how a supplier will deliver service and how they think about service is really important as a part of the assessment. The third area is operational excellence, and this is where your cost, quality, service, delivery measures kind of come in. But other things are a part of that as well, like how do they handle change management? Whether you're buying a good or a service, as things change, how do they work through those changes? How can you be ensured that it's going to be consistent on the backside of the change? What kind of labor considerations should you have? Are they union, or are there labor disputes that need to be taken into consideration? So all those things are part of operational excellence. The P is for product and process innovation, and the notion here is, many businesses are good at their current business, but they can't innovate. And so we shouldn't assume that that's easy. And there's a whole lot of depth that we should go into to analyze whether a supplier is good at that or not. And then the last is economic viability. And this is around looking at their financial health and what risks can you see if you're really good at looking at key financial metrics for a supplier. Once again, all of this is not, you don't do this analysis to say a supplier is good or bad. You do it so that you can put the things on the table that you need to work through in order to make business-to-business relationship work. And if you do this analysis well, you can, if you have a routine and a consistent way of doing this analysis, it can allow the buyer to categorize suppliers and plan different actions. So you can see here, if you're looking at categorizing who are my growth suppliers, for example, well, having done that analysis, that scope analysis helps you to determine and substantiate why a certain supplier should be a growth supplier versus one that should be limited, for example. So the goal here is really to do things that put you in a proactive position versus constantly reacting to the problems that are a result of poor due diligence. So that's the first topic I wanted to discuss. Moving into the second topic, assuming that we have done good due diligence and we have categorized our suppliers, then for those top two categories, we'll call those grow and maintain, those suppliers that are proving that they are satisfying many of our needs, then we can look at how do we work on the relationship with those suppliers. So the second topic is supplier relationship management. And this speaks to some research that was done by the University of Tennessee's supply chain department. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but UT does a good job, a good bit of research in the supply chain area. And a couple of years ago, they put out a white paper, and it identified the top 10 reasons for business-to-business relationship failure. And you might be surprised, but supplier performance, poor supplier performance was actually number 7 out of 10. And I wasn't surprised by that at all. It very much is in line with my experience. The top reasons for supplier and customer relationship failure are usually all these other things, mostly unclear expectations, misaligned interests, poor governance, bad communication, no bad information flow, not having a good idea of what is mutual benefit. So all these things get in our way, but we call it, a lot of customers will call it poor supplier performance. And so I wanted to speak to that for a few minutes because I think I want to talk about just 3 of these areas because I think they're really relevant. So first of all, what is supplier relationship management? If you go online, you look up SRM or supplier relationship management, you might see a lot of different definitions. This is the definition that I am talking about. This is what I like to use. And it gets at, you can see the underlying words here. It is a disciplined approach. It's active. It involves planning what you want the relationship to be. So you have to be clear about what you're trying to get out of this relationship so you can plan what you want this relationship to be. It is inclusive of all stakeholders. So where we talk about it manages all interactions with suppliers, it's not saying that, for instance, me as a buyer, I'm going to be involved in all interactions. No, that's ridiculous. What it's saying, though, is as a company, we should be speaking with one voice so that the supplier feels like they have consistency across all interactions. But somebody's got to make that happen. Somebody's got to align people so that you can speak with one voice. And why do we do that? Well, it's about maximizing value. And ideally, it's around maximizing value for all parties. And so it's focused on that. In other words, it's about this aligned interest. And I think most people, when they look at supplier relationship management, they forget that part, quite frankly. They talk a lot about segmenting suppliers. And then what do you do after that? That's not, segmenting suppliers doesn't give you value. Actually, SRM has 4 different parts to it. So segmentation is first, but after you segment, you've got to set some good expectations. There's got to be some understanding of the expectations between the parties. That should translate into some tangible actions, and then you got to measure it. So you've got to have some governance mechanism. So SRM is a comprehensive methodology for relationship management. And if done well, it should drive many benefits. And the benefits should look like delivering more value, quite frankly. And you can deliver value in tangible ways you can deliver value in ways that are more behind the scenes, like improve utilization of both parties' resources. Sometimes that can lead to very obvious efficiencies, and sometimes it's just the right thing to do. So we're looking for ways that we can make the business-to-business relationship operate as smooth as possible. So what is segmentation? I could spend a lot of time on this, but I'm just going to give you just the highlights. Each company may use different descriptors, but it's the same notion. We use a triangle to describe the segments because most suppliers for a business are in the base of the triangle. There are more transactional relationships than there are strategic relationships, for example. What do we mean by, I'm not going to define really these three areas in detail, but just to give you some indication, what do I mean by transactional? Transactional would mean I need a transactional relationship because what I'm buying is industry standard, maybe lightly customized, but there's a lot of options, and I don't need anything unique and different for me, so I can operate in a transactional relationship just fine. Critical by choice would be appropriate where I need something that's a little more customized or maybe highly customized and unique for me, and I need a relationship to deliver on that. You know, the supplier has to be a lot closer to our needs because they have to customize more. A critical by force relationship is limited. It says usually this relationship is the result of a supplier that has maybe some patent or some unique know-how that nobody else has, and so the relationship is kind of forced. As a buyer, I don't have many, if any, options, and it's a different type of dynamic. And then you have strategic, or people call this different things, but usually the relationship at the top of the triangle is appropriate where there's new investment required. So it's something that requires some high risk and high reward kind of trade-off. And the transactional and critical business relationships are important to your current business, and the strategic are really critical to some future business need that you're trying to create. So that's just a simple way to think about this. This is not about moving up the triangle. You are where you are. You can do very, important things in every element. So the word strategic shouldn't throw anybody off. But that's a way to think about segmentation. And the way we don't think about how to put suppliers into a certain segment, what we should not be looking at is we shouldn't be looking at segmenting based on spend. We shouldn't be looking at segmenting based on how long we've been in business together or how much we like each other. It really is based on a lot of analysis and understanding strategically where we need to go in this business category that we're spending our money on. So that's the first part of SRM. And one other thing I wanted to note about segmentation is just because you're in a certain segment, it doesn't mean that you have, either no competition or no collaboration at play. So even in a strategic relationship, you still have to go through some kind of competitive process in order to determine who is the right one or two suppliers to do that work with. And so it involves still a competitive force as well as it's highly collaborative in that relationship type. And similarly, in a transactional relationship, it's not devoid of collaboration. It's just less collaboration is required than it is at the top of the triangle. So these forces are always at play, and a strategic buyer will be balancing them appropriately to get the value proposition that they're looking for. Okay, so moving through that, another top reason for failure, I said, was unclear expectations. And expectations expectations are the second part of SRM. So, what do we mean by expectations? Well, here are 5 areas that whether you're a buyer or a seller, we should be explicitly talking about and aligning expectations in all these 5 areas on a regular basis. So, how do we talk about our expectations for risk management? So, for example, a contract is a risk management tool. It says, it doesn't say that having a contract makes things go right. A contract is what happens when things go wrong. And so it's all about risk management. So if you're a buyer and you're not, and you're pushing on your supplier for, let's say, you want better service, but you don't have anything documented to say what happens if service is bad, you're setting an expectation that, you're willing to accept variations in service. Similarly, if you're a seller and your buyer comes to you with a 10-page contract that they say, hey, these are our terms, you have to sign this to get into business with us, we shouldn't be fearful of that. We should say, okay, what kind of risks are you trying to prepare for? Because that'll help me think about this contract better and understand where I need to give and maybe where you need to give. So that's what we're talking about in terms of risk management expectations as an example. I'll jump down to cost. Cost is something that we're always talking about, but are we really? Are we talking about cost? Or are we talking about price? So I think conversations, when we're setting expectations related to cost management, we should be clear. Are we talking about the cost side, are we talking about the costs that are only on the supplier side of the ledger? Or are we talking about all the costs, which involve things that the buyer does to create maybe increased costs? So that digging into that helps you establish better expectations for how to manage cost. I'm going to skip over innovation and just go to the last area, which is trust, relationship and trust building. And this is one, I bet the first 4 areas are areas that most people would think of as relevant, but sometimes people don't understand the importance of trust enhancement. And trust really makes everything else work, quite frankly. Trust is a big part of our relationships, whether we acknowledge it or not. I think we should be more intentional about acknowledging it. So how does what kind of things are trust expectations? So if you think about things like, information flow. So, the supplier is always at the end of the road of information. So the customer had a certain delivery window that they talked with the supplier. The supplier said, yep, if you get me the specs by this date, I can deliver that. If you get me the statement of work by this date, I can deliver that expectation. And then what happens over time? Change, the date goes away. Now we're crunched and the supplier gets no relief. That is poor information flow, and it causes all of us to conspire to have a less than optimal result. And it diminishes trust in the relationship, because who's going to get blamed? The supplier's going to get blamed for not meeting the deadline when they didn't have the time that was promised at the beginning when they committed to meet the deadline. So that's just one example. I'm sure you can think of many. But all of these things play together. And if we do a better job of really putting our expectations on the table and clarifying our expectations, we can have a much better relationship. So the third part of SRM is, once you've established those expectations by segment, then what kind of actions would be appropriate? And you can develop even an action plan. And so this just says, for each of those areas, each of those expectation areas, there are different actions that I would take based on if a supplier was considered a critical supplier or a transactional supplier, for example. And once again, I'm not going to talk through this. I will in the Q&A if you have questions, but in the interest of time, I want to keep moving on. So the last area of SRM that I wanted to talk about is poor governance, because I said we have to have a way to govern, we have to have a way to measure what is happening in order to ensure success. And so in terms of governance, you know, I believe you get what you measure, so you need to measure some stuff. It's just a question of what to measure and how to measure. For goods, we tend to measure things in a scorecard. If there's any measurement going on, it's usually a tactical scorecard. And tactical scorecards are activity measures. Usually they're filled with activities. So, you know, you delivered on this date or you didn't. You delivered within this time window or you didn't. You delivered within this quality parameter or you didn't. So it's activity measures, and they're high frequency, you know, very frequent, daily, weekly. Services, we tend to measure services in terms of output measures or outcomes. So, for example, if I were being measured for this webinar, I'm delivering a service. It's, you know, the measurement wouldn't be you actually did the webinar on this date at this time. That would be an activity measure. The measurement would be, you know, this is the feedback we got out on the back side of the webinar. This is the kind of an overall assessment of how much you delivered on the content requirement, and that's an outcome measure. So services, more outcome-based, less frequent. Goods, more activity-based and more frequent. It doesn't matter, you know, how many things you're measuring. You should just measure something that's relevant to tell you whether things are progressing or there's a problem. So I encourage people, you know, just get started. Pick one or two things, agree on what they are, and just measure them consistently, not with the focus on, you know, making somebody feel bad every time the measurement is bad, but really looking at, okay, is this a trend? What can we do to continuously improve and get better so that this relationship delivers the value that we're looking for? So the first part we talked about, you know, really assessing and analyzing suppliers. If you do a good job of that, you can adequately determine who should you be building your relationship with and work on the steps of segmenting and setting expectations, determining the right actions, and governing those relationships. All right, so now I'm going to transition kind of a little to the left and just add in our third topic, which is about building a diverse supply base. And so the way this is related is, you know, I find that a lot of diverse suppliers have an even harder time being assessed, because over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been such a focus on consolidation of suppliers. And so a lot of companies don't even know how to bring in a new supplier, let alone look at a diverse supplier. And I say it that way because there's really no difference. A diverse supplier, if you're calling them a diverse supplier, it's usually because they're new. So I think we need to think about this in the context of the other two topics, quite frankly. But what is supplier diversity about? It's about ensuring inclusive economic growth. And so, you know, we're looking to expand the amount of opportunity for all suppliers to grow their business, because the economy needs it. You know, small businesses create more jobs. Businesses need it because small businesses, when I say small, it's all relative, so smaller businesses tend to be more agile and creative, and large businesses need an infusion of that creativity on a regular basis, and a lot of where they get that are from their suppliers. So if this is why we do it, then we have to be open to rewarding. If you're a buyer, we have to be open to rewarding new ways and new ideas. And if you're a seller, you have to be offering new ways and new ideas as a differentiator, because it's a lot of work to bring in a new supplier. Whether you're adding a supplier or displacing a supplier, it's a lot of work, and you don't want to do it for a me too. It has to be something better that's going to come out of it. So we have to better articulate that differentiation in terms of what better outcomes will come out of that. So just to, I did put this slide in here just to make sure that everybody is on the same page around what am I talking about with diverse suppliers. There's minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses. Those are the three kind of most common. But in addition, some companies are publicly stating that they want to grow businesses with LGBTQ owners or with local businesses. I worked with a client once that had a stated goal to spend 50% with businesses within a 200-mile radius of where they were. So that was the same kind of program, if you will, or classification need of having a diverse supplier. Some have a stated goal around small business owners, just based on size. So it's the same amount, it's the same approach and mindset, and it goes back to due diligence. How are we really assessing who has those good strategic, operational, and chemistry fit for our business within these classifications? The journey of supplier diversity, they're started as programs, and programs primarily driven with a government set-aside kind of methodology. And, the approach was, diverse suppliers are required, having diverse suppliers in your mix were a requirement. And, the approach from diverse suppliers was kind of, you're required to have me, here I am. We've evolved in today's mindset is more around recognizing that there are a lot of benefits from working with diverse suppliers. And so what businesses tend to do now is have supplier diversity as a criteria. It's not a single criteria. It's part of the overall value analysis. And so if you think about, weighting all the different things you need, let's say, quality is worth 20% of a supplier's assessment score, and supplier diversity might be 10%. It will depend. It will be different for every business and every category that the supplier's in. But it is a criteria, and so all things being equal, what that means is the business is not awarded because of it. It is an extra consideration within the overall criteria. And moving forward, companies that are really, really forward-thinking in supplier diversity, they're really looking on how do they increase that value proposition beyond just the transactional relationship, if you will, of buying and selling, but really looking on how to deliver more through the communities that should be benefiting, back to our definition of economic inclusion and economic growth. So that's kind of the evolution of supplier diversity. Typically in supplier diversity, we talk about tier 1, tier 2. I wanted to just spend a minute making sure that everybody had a clear understanding of that. So if we look at this, on the left side, what I'll call the corporate jargon is you have corporations as a customer, and they call their suppliers tier 1, and they call their suppliers tier 2. On the government side, on the right, suppliers to government spending are usually called prime suppliers, and suppliers to prime are called subs. So this terminology is different, but it's really focused on the same thing. And so it really kind of starts at the bottom is what is the need from the supply chain's ultimate customer, whether a corporation or a government entity, and they're looking for meeting that definition, expanded economic inclusion. That's what they're trying to do. And they're doing that through how they spend their money. And who do they spend their money with? Well, they spend it with the tier ones or the prime suppliers. And what they're looking for them is to have companies able to focus and give them what they need. But they need that with more creative solutions and with lower costs, increasingly, lower costs over time, increasingly. And the key thing there is, in order to be focused on efficiency and getting those lower costs, you can't do everything. You've got to really get smarter about what your core competency is and focus on that, and then find ways to use a sub-supply chain to do those things that are non-core. And so that's where Tier 2 and subs have come into the mix to say that's another opportunity. And because of the dynamic I mentioned earlier, where all this consolidation of supply has happened, prime or Tier 1 suppliers have gotten larger and larger in order to be able to serve a corporate or government entity. And so Tier 2 suppliers are also larger and larger. They're not just small, itty-bitty new startups, et cetera. That's an inappropriate notion. And a lot of diverse suppliers will start in the Tier 2 position. Most, quite frankly, will stay in a Tier 2 position. And that's fine, because they can deliver their core competencies to fit into that supply chain. So last thing I want to say about supplier diversity is there's a lot of different ways within supplier diversity for majority firms and minority or veteran or women-owned firms to partner to create an effective Tier 1, Tier 2 structure. And these are just a couple of those ways. And things like mentor-protege, so no formal relationship. Mentor-protege would be an informal arrangement. Teaming and partnering would be an informal relationship. And in both those cases, it's kind of, we can help each other. Let's go together and see if we can satisfy this need together without any formality. The other three, 51-49% ownership is corporate structure, with the 51% ownership on the minority side. Joint ventures is, once again, a corporate structure. It's a formal arrangement that says, we have it could say it could be structured a lot of ways, but it typically says, we're going to go together and here's all the rules of the game. This is how we're going to play together to go after this business and satisfy this business, and this is how we share in the benefits of that. And a strategic alliance is very much the same. It's a very formal, documented way of saying, we may be two separate entities and we do our own thing, but when we come together, this is how we're going to work together, and this is how we're going to share the benefits. So you can have formal and informal ways to have businesses work together. So in summary, I talked about due diligence, and due diligence really does drive success. And, we need to go deep into due diligence to make sure that we're identifying suppliers that really can match the needs of our business into the future. So if you're a buyer, it's all about making sure that we are identifying the right suppliers and get rid of that terminology around a good or a bad supplier. Supplier relationship management is a methodology, and it's one that has a specific intent, and that intent is about delivering value. So really think about ways, tools, changing the conversation, whether you're on the buyer side or the seller side, to really get at what does value look like to you now. I know when we started our business relationship, this is what it looked like, but I want to talk about what does it look like now? How do I need to make changes to make sure I'm staying ahead of what you need in those 5 areas that we talked about? And then great relationships are made. They really don't just fall out of the sky. They take a lot of work. And part of the work is making sure we have aligned interests, clear expectations, and some way to measure whether or not it's working. So with that, I am open for questions, and I'll turn it back to Crystal.
Okay, thank you so much, Toi. I am going to see if we have any questions, and I will read the questions, and we will allow her to answer those questions. Let me see. Let me go to the question. Okay, Toi, here is one question. When you spoke about tools, having tools for supplier relationship management, what are some of those tools that you've seen that can be used for that?
Great question. So I'm going to go back here to the slide that had the 5 areas. This one. So one of the tools that I think is really effective is to just have call it a relationship development plan that looks at these 5 areas. So if you can think of it, on the left-hand side, you'd have each of these 5 areas. And then on the right-hand side, you would say, okay, given where we are in our business relationship, what does risk management look like to you? How, what do you have or need to have in terms of improving in risk management? And so, you could talk about things like, one of the things well, inventory, back to inventory. Inventory is a risk management tool, right? Ideally, you would never have it. The reason we have it is in case something bad happens, because our supply chains aren't in totally synchronized. So how can we reduce that, or how can we shift how we manage inventory? We still want to take care of the risk that's inherent, the need for the inventory, but how can we reduce it? That's an example of a risk management action. And by working on that, you're showing the customer, if you're the supplier, you're showing the customer, hey, I'm in this with you. I have ideas to improve the value that I can deliver to help you manage your risk. And if you're the buyer, you're having this discussion to really help the supplier understand where your high-risk areas are as you see them, and really asking for their solutions to say, hey, how can you help me reduce or manage these risks? So you can do that for all 5 of these, the top 4 areas specifically. And then on the last one, on trust, it's a kind of a different conversation, but it's the same in terms of figuring out what do we want to do together to help build our trust. So things like we want to meet twice a year, and we're not going to talk about, the latest thing that's going on. We want to talk about how can we improve the flow of information? How can we change the perception of a certain stakeholder? How can we, do a better job of changing the scorecard so we're measuring the right things? All those things are trust-enhancing behaviors versus trust-diminishing behaviors. And you can document that as a part of a development plan for building the relationship. So that would be an example of a tool for SRM.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. It says, I'm an overseas direct import supplier to Walmart. How does a manufacturer like me build a relationship with a company that weighs cost before even thinking about relationship? Do you have any thoughts? I ask because my first meeting with Walmart is next week. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Timely. So no doubt about it. Retail customers are the margins are so thin that they're working in. They are cost focused. And so I guess the number one thing that comes to mind is trying to expand the definition of cost. I think one of the best things that you can do is have Walmart, in this case, really look at what are the total costs that we're working with. If you're an overseas distributor, then there's a lot of areas where cost is involved. And so if you're going to measure the success of our relationship on total cost, some of these things I have control over as a distributor, some of these things I don't have control over. And you want to really get into that discussion, because the things that you don't have control over, maybe they have an expectation that you would. And that's important to know up front. Or maybe there's some things that you don't have control over, but they actually have so much leverage in the market that they have control over it. And you need to work with them better to exert that influence. So getting that out on the table as soon as possible, I think, is really, really important. Just make sure you don't get boxed into, as a supplier, you're responsible for all of the quote unquote costs when you really only have a portion of area that you can do anything with. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much for that answer, Toi. Do we have any other questions? We want to be really respectful of her time. And actually, the person who asked that question says yes. Here's another question. Another question for MBEs. You have to prove your ethnic origin. Is this taken into consideration? Wait a minute, this question jumped. Let me go back up. Okay, I'm sorry. Is this taken into consideration on the corporate side? So let me restate that question, Toi. I'm sorry, it broke up because another question popped up. It says, for an MBE, you have to prove your ethnic origin, okay? Is this taken into consideration on the corporate side?
Yes. So this is where these definitions come in. So, and this is, I shouldn't say just the definition, this is where the certifications come in. So, if you're an MBE, there are different certifying bodies. The most notable is the National Minority Supplier Development Council will certify you as an MBE. And what they're certifying is that you meet the requirements of having a minimum of 51% ownership based on one of these ethnic backgrounds. And so that is the purpose of certification. And the corporations basically outsource, if you will. They say, okay, I don't have to do all of that part of the due diligence because the certification bodies are doing that for me. And that's why it's important to become certified, because they don't have the bandwidth to go and do all that work for every potential supplier that wants to get in. They really are making sure that that is taken care of through the certification process.
And I have, and this will be the last question. Toi did show you her slide, so if you need to contact her after this webinar, you have her contact information. So here's the last question. As a small minority business, I find it hard to break the glass ceiling. As an individual, I have years of experience in various industries. As a new company operating for 2 years, the business has limited industry experience, less than 3 years of financials, and sometimes do not meet the financial thresholds. Any advice?
Oh, gosh.
I had to think about that one, too. I have some comments on that, but I'm going to let Toi answer that question.
Well, I would need to know more to give you a great answer. What I could tell you, though, is I'll use my own story. So I had years of, corporate experience, a relatively, wonderful corporate pedigree, if you will. I had been a buyer for many, many years, and so I had a lot of, I had bought in multiple industries across the world. So I had a large network, is what I'm trying to say. I had a large network of people. And when I started my business, it took 2 years really to get the first, what I'll call, engagement. So part of this is, our own expectation for how long it takes to kind of break in. So you know, it's not so unusual. I guess what I'm saying is it's not so unusual. But what do we do, you know, to try to make that, either reduce that time or make that first engagement the biggest and best it can be? We have to really keep refreshing our value proposition. So for myself, you know, when I left corporate America, I spoke corporate America. I had to change my language. As a supplier, the companies that I was trying to do business with, they didn't quite understand what I was talking about. And so I had to challenge myself on, you know, am I putting myself out there in a way that's understandable? I also had to challenge myself. I thought people could just automatically see, oh, this is, you know, these are all the ways I can help you. And I had to keep refreshing my value proposition so that I got better about telling my customers what they could expect from working with me. So those are just a couple of things that I would say right off the bat. Crystal, you add to that.
I'll take that offline. I'm being respectful of your time. But for the person who sent that question, I'm Crystal Davis, crystal@connexus.com. Please feel free to email me, and we can take that offline. But an addendum to her question, she does provide professional services.
Yeah, it's hard in services. Just the last thing I'll say on that point is back to value, right? Value's in the eye of the beholder. And so for the in services, the person who, or the organization that will use that service, that will benefit from that service, really try to dissect how do they talk about value. You might be selling yourself in the way that you see the value, but it really is incumbent to understand how they talk about the value and sell it to them that way, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. Well, again, Toi, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I thought this was wonderful information. And also, for the participants or the registrants on the call, please do not forget to take the time to answer those very 4 short questions that are going to be at the end of this webinar. And you know, we just want to thank everybody for taking time out of your busy day to attend. And if you have any additional questions for Toi, her slide is up with her contact information. Or if you have any additional questions for myself or ConnXus, please feel free to contact us. So again, thank you very much. Be on the lookout for additional ConnexSmart or My Connection webinars that will be coming up in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, all.